The ninth Tuesday, we talk about how love goes on. The leaves had begun to change color, turning the ride through West Newton into a portrait of gold and rust. Back in Detroit, the labor war had stagnated, with each side accusing the other of failing to communicate. The stories on the TV news were just as depressing. In rural Kentucky, 3 men threw pieces of a tombstone off of a bridge, smashing the windshield of a passing car, killing a teenage girl who was traveling with her family on a religious pilgrimage. In California, the O.J. Simpson trial was heading toward a conclusion, and the whole country seemed to be obsessed. Even in airports, there were hanging TV sets turned to CNN so that you could get an O.J. update as you made your way to a gate. I had tried calling my brother in Spain several times. I left messages saying that I really wanted to talk to him, that I had been doing a lot of thinking about us. A few weeks later, I got back a short message saying everything was okay, but he was sorry. He really didn't feel like talking about being sick. For my old professor, it was not the talk of being sick, but the being sick itself that was sinking him. Since my last visit, a nurse had inserted a catheter into his penis, which drew the urine out through a tube and into a bag that sat at the foot of his chair. His legs needed constant tending. He could still feel pain, even though he could not move them, another one of ALS's cruel little ironies. And unless his feet dangled just the right number of inches off of the phone pads, it felt as if someone was poking him with a fork. In the middle of conversations, Maury had to ask visitors to lift his foot and move it just an inch, or to adjust his head so that it could fit more easily into the palm of the colored pillows. Can you imagine being unable to move your own head? With each visit, Maury seemed to be melting into his chair, his spine taking on its shape. Still, every morning he insisted on being lifted from his bed and wheeled to his study, deposited there among his books and papers and the hibiscus plant on the windowsill. In typical fashion, he found something philosophical in this. "I sum it up in my newest aphorism," he said. "Let me hear it. When you're in bed, you're dead." He smiled. Only Maury could smile at something like that. He had been getting calls from Nightline people and from Ted Koppel himself. "They want me to come and do another show with me," he said, "but they say they want to wait." "Until what? You're on your last breath?" "Maybe. Anyhow, I'm not so far away." "Don't say that." "I'm sorry." "That bugs me, that they want to wait until you wither." "It bugs you because you look out for me." He smiled. "Mitch, maybe they are using me for a little drama. That's okay. Maybe I'm using them too. They help me get my message to millions of people. I couldn't do that without them, right? So it's a compromise." He coughed, which turned into a long, drawn-out gargle, ending with another glob into a crushed tissue. "Anyhow," Maury said, "I told them they better not wait too long, because my voice won't be there. Once this thing hits my lungs, talking may become impossible. I can't speak for too long without needing a rest now. I have already canceled a lot of people who want to see me, Mitch. There are so many. But I'm too fatigued. If I can't give them the right attention, I can't help them." I looked at the tape recorder, feeling guilty, as if I were stealing what was left of his precious speaking time. "Should we skip it?" I asked. "Will it make you too tired?" Maury shut his eyes and shook his head. He seemed to be waiting for some silent pain to pass. "No," he finally said. "You and I have to go on. This is our last thesis together, you know." "Our last thesis?" "We want to get it right. I thought about our first thesis together in college. It was Maury's idea, of course. He told me I was good enough to write an honors project, something I had never considered. Now here we were, doing the same thing once more, starting with an idea. Dying man talks to living man, tells him what he should know. This time, I was in less of a hurry to finish. Someone asked me an interesting question yesterday, Maury said now, looking over my shoulder at the wall hanging behind me, a quilt of hopeful messages that friends had stitched for him on his 70th birthday. Each patch on the quilt had a different message. Stay the course. The best is yet to be. Maury, always number one in mental health. What was the question? I asked. If I worried about being forgotten after I died? Well, do you? I don't think I will be. I've got so many people who have been involved with me in close, intimate ways. And love is how you stay alive, even after you've gone. Sounds like a song lyric. Love is how you stay alive. Maury chuckled. Maybe. But, Mitch, all this talk that we're doing, do you ever hear my voice sometimes when you're back home? When you're all alone? Maybe on the plane? Maybe in your car? Yes, I admitted. Then you will not forget me after I'm gone. Think of my voice, and I'll be there. Think of your voice. And if you want to cry a little, it's okay. Maury. He had wanted to make me cry since I was a freshman. One of these days, I'm going to get you, he would say. Yeah, yeah, I would answer. I decided what I want on my tombstone, he said. I did not want to hear about tombstones. Why? They make you nervous? I shrugged. We can forget it. No, go ahead. What did you decide? Maury popped his lips. I was thinking of this. A teacher to the last. He waited while I absorbed it. A teacher to the last. Good? He said. Yes, I said. Very good. I came to love the way Maury lit up when I entered the room. He did this for many people, I know, but it was his special talent to make each visitor feel that that smile was unique. Ah, it's my buddy, he would say when he saw me, in that foggy, high-pitched voice. And it didn't stop with the greeting. When Maury was with you, he was really with you. He looked you straight in the eye, and he listened as if you were the only person in the world. How much better would people get along if their first encounter each day were like this, instead of a grumble from a waitress or a bus driver or a boss? I believe in being fully present, Maury said. That means you should be with the person you're with. When I'm talking to you now, Mitch, I try to keep focused only on what is going on between us. I am not thinking about something we said last week. I am not thinking of what's coming up this Friday. I am not thinking about doing another couple show or about what medications I'm taking. I am talking to you. I am thinking about you. I remembered how he used to teach this idea in the group process class back at Brandy's. I had scoffed back then, thinking this was hardly a lesson plan for a university course. Learning to pay attention? How important could that be? I now know it is more important than almost everything they taught us in college. Maury motioned for my hand, and as I gave it to him, I felt a surge of guilt. Here was a man who, if he wanted, could spend every waking moment in self-pity, feeling his body for decay, counting his breaths. So many people with far smaller problems are so self-absorbed, their eyes glaze over if you speak for more than 30 seconds. They already have something else in mind, a friend to call, a fax to send, a lover they're daydreaming about. They only snap back to full attention when you finish talking, at which point they say, uh-huh, or yeah, really, and fake their way back to the moment. Part of the problem, Mitch, is that everyone is in such a hurry, Maury said. People haven't found meaning in their lives, so they're running all the time looking for it. They think the next car, the next house, the next job. Then they find those things are empty, too, and they keep running. Once you start running, I said, it's hard to slow yourself down. Not so hard, he said, shaking his head. Do you know what I do? When someone wants to get ahead of me in traffic, when I used to be able to drive, I would raise my hand. He tried to do this now, but the hand lifted weakly, only 6 inches. I would raise my hand, as if I was going to make a negative gesture, and then I would wave and smile. Instead of giving them the finger, you let them go, and you smile. You know what? A lot of times they smiled back. The truth is, I don't have to be in that much of a hurry with my car. I would rather put my energies into people. He did this better than anyone I'd ever known. Those who sat with him saw his eyes go moist when they spoke about something horrible, or crinkle in delight when they told him a really bad joke. He was always ready to openly display the emotion so often missing from my baby boomer generation. We are great at small talk. What do you do? Where do you live? But really listening to someone without trying to sell them something, pick them up, recruit them, or get some kind of status in return. How often do we get this anymore? I believe many visitors in the last few months of Maury's life were drawn not because of the attention they wanted to pay to him, but because of the attention he paid to them. Despite his personal pain and decay, this little old man listened the way they always wanted someone to listen. I told him he was the father everyone wishes they had. Well, he said, closing his eyes, I have some experience in that area. The last time Maury saw his own father was in a city morgue. Charlie Schwartz was a quiet man who liked to read his newspaper, alone, under a street lamp on Tremont Avenue in the Bronx. Every night when Maury was little, Charlie would go for a walk after dinner. He was a small Russian man with a ruddy complexion and a full head of grayish hair. Maury and his brother, David, would look out the window and see him leaning against the lamppost, and Maury wished he would come inside and talk to them. But he rarely did. Nor did he tuck them in, nor kiss them goodnight. Maury always swore he would do these things for his own children if he ever had any. And years later, when he had them, he did. Meanwhile, as Maury raised his own children, Charlie was still living in the Bronx. He still took that walk. He still read the paper. One night, he went outside after dinner. A few blocks from home, he was accosted by two robbers. Give us your money, one said, pulling a gun. Frightened, Charlie threw down his wallet and began to run. He ran through the streets and kept running until he reached the steps of a relative's house, where he collapsed on the porch. Heart attack. He died that night. Maury was called to identify the body. He flew to New York and went to the morgue. He was taken downstairs to the cold room where the corpses were kept. Is this your father? The attendant asked. Maury looked at the body behind the glass, the body of the man who had scolded him and molded him and taught him to work, who had been quiet when Maury wanted him to speak, who had told Maury to swallow his memories of his mother when he wanted to share them with the world. He nodded, and he walked away. The horror of the room, he would later say, sucked all other functions out of him. He did not cry until days later. Still, his father's death helped prepare Maury for his own. This much he knew. There would be lots of holding and kissing and talking and laughter and no goodbyes left unsaid. All the things he missed with his father and his mother. When the final moment came, Maury wanted his loved ones around him, knowing what was happening. No one would get a phone call or a telegram or have to look through a glass window in some cold and foreign basement. In the South American rainforest, there is a tribe called the Desana, who see the world as a fixed quantity of energy that flows between all creatures. Every birth must therefore engender a death, and every death bring forth another birth. This way, the energy of the world remains complete. When they hunt for food, the Desana knew that the animals they kill will leave a hole in the spiritual well. But that hole will be filled, they believed, by the souls of the Desana hunters when they die. Were there no men dying, there would be no birds or fish being born. I like this idea. Maury likes it too. The closer he gets to goodbye, the more it seems to feel we are all creatures in the same forest. What we take, we must replenish. It's only fair, he says. The 10th Tuesday, we talk about marriage. I brought a visitor to meet Maury, my wife. He had been asking me since the first day I came. When do I meet Janine? When are you bringing her? I had always had excuses until a few days earlier, when I called his house to see how he was doing. It took a while for Maury to get to the receiver, and when he did, I could hear the fumbling as someone held it to his ear. He could no longer lift a phone by himself. "Hi," he gasped. "You doing okay, Coach?" I heard him exhale. "Mitch, your coach isn't having such a great day." His sleeping time was getting worse. He needed oxygen almost nightly now, and his coughing spells had become frightening. One cough could last an hour, and he never knew if he would be able to stop. He always said he would die when the disease got his lungs. I shuddered when I thought how close death was. "I'll see you on Tuesday," I said. "You'll have a better day then." "Mitch?" "Yeah." "Is your wife there with you?" She was sitting next to me. "Put her on. I want to hear her voice." Now, I am married to a woman blessed with far more intuitive kindness than I. Although she had never met Maury, she took the phone. I would have shaken my head and whispered, "I'm not here, I'm not here." And in a minute, she was connecting with my old professor as if they'd known each other since college. I sensed this, even though all I heard on my end was, "Uh-huh. Mitch told me, oh, thank you." When she hung up, she said, "I'm coming next trip." And that was that. Now we sat in his office, surrounding him in his recliner. Maury, by his own admission, was a harmless flirt, and while he often had to stop for coughing or to use the commode, he seemed to find new reserves of energy with Janine in the room. He looked at photos from our wedding, which Janine had brought along. "You are from Detroit?" Maury said. "Yes," Janine said. "I taught in Detroit for 1 year in the late 40s. I remember a funny story about that." He stopped to blow his nose. When he fumbled with the tissue, I held it in place and he blew weakly into it. I squeezed it tightly against his nostrils, then pulled it off, like a mother does to a child in a car seat. "Thank you, Mitch." He looked at Janine. "My helper, this one is." Janine smiled. Anyhow, my story. There were a bunch of sociologists at the university, and we used to play poker with the other staff members, including this guy who was a surgeon. One night, after the game, he said, "Maury, I want to come see you work." I said fine. So he came to one of my classes and watched me teach. After the class was over, he said, "All right, now how would you like to see me work? I have an operation tonight." I wanted to return the favor, so I said okay. He took me up to the hospital. He said, "Scrub down, put on a mask, and get into a gown." The next thing I knew, I was right next to him at the operating table. There was this woman, the patient, on the table, naked from the waist down. And he took a knife and went zip, just like that. Well, Maury lifted a finger and spun it around. I started to go like this. I'm about to faint. All the blood, ugh. The nurse next to me said, "What's the matter, doctor?" And I said, "I'm no damn doctor. Get me out of here." We laughed, and Maury laughed too, as hard as he could, with his limited breathing. It was the first time in weeks that I could recall him telling a story like this. How strange, I thought, that he nearly fainted once from watching someone else's illness, and now he was so able to endure his own. Connie knocked on the door and said that Maury's lunch was ready. It was not the carrot soup and vegetable cakes and Greek pasta I had brought that morning from Bread and Circus. Although I tried to buy the softest of foods now, they were still beyond Maury's limited strength to chew and swallow. He was eating mostly liquid supplements, with perhaps a bran muffin tossed in it until it was mushy and easily digested. Charlotte would puree almost everything in a blender now. He was taking food through a straw. I still shopped every week and walked in with bags to show him, but it was more for the look on his face than anything else. When I opened the refrigerator, I would see an overflow of containers. I guess I was hoping that one day we would go back to eating a real lunch together, and I could watch the sloppy way in which he would talk while chewing, the food spilling happily out of his mouth. This was a foolish hope. "So, Janine," Maury said. She smiled. "You are lovely. Give me your hand." She did. "Mitch says that you're a professional singer." "Yes," Janine said. "He says you're great." "Oh," she laughed. "No, he just says that." Maury raised his eyebrows. "Will you sing something for me?" Now, I've heard people ask this of Janine for almost as long as I've known her. When people find out you sing for a living, they always say, "Sing something from us." Shy about her talent and a perfectionist about conditions, Janine never did. She would politely decline, which is what I expected now, which is when she began to sing. "The very thought of you, and I forget to do the little ordinary things that everyone ought to do." It was a 1930 standard, written by Ray Noble, and Janine sang it sweetly, looking straight at Maury. I was amazed, once again, at his ability to draw emotion from people who otherwise kept it locked away. Maury closed his eyes to absorb the notes. As my wife's loving voice filled the room, a crescent smile appeared on his face. And while his body was stiff as a sandbag, you could almost see him dancing inside it. "I see your face in every flower, your eyes and stars above. It's just the thought of you, the very thought of you, my love." When she finished, Maury opened his eyes and tears rolled down his cheeks. In all the years I have listened to my wife sing, I never heard the way she did at that moment. Marriage. Almost everyone I knew had a problem with it. Some had problems getting into it. Some had problems getting out. My generation seemed to struggle with the commitment, as if it were an agitator for some murky swamp. I had gotten used to attending weddings, congratulating the couple, and feeling only mild surprise when I saw the groom a few years later sitting in a restaurant with a younger woman who he introduced as a friend. You know, I'm separated from so and so, he would say. Why do we have such problems? I asked Maury about this. Having waited 7 years before I proposed to Janine, I wondered if people my age were being more careful than those who became before us, or simply more selfish. Well, I feel sorry for your generation, Maury said. In this culture, it's so important to find a loving relationship with someone because so much of the culture does not give you that. But the poor kids today, either they're too selfish to take part in a real loving relationship, or they rush into marriage and then 6 months later they get divorced. They don't know what they want in a partner. They don't know who they are themselves. So how can they know who they're marrying? He sighed. Maury had canceled so many unhappy lovers in his years as a professor. It's sad, because a loved one is so important. You realize that, especially when you're in a time like I am, when you're not doing so well. Friends are great, but friends are not going to be here on a night when you're coughing and can't sleep, and someone has to sit up all night with you, comfort you, try to be helpful. Charlotte and Maury, who met as students, had been married 44 years. I watched them together now, when she would remind him of his medication, or come and stroke his neck, or talk about one of their sons. They worked as a team, often needing no more than a silent glance to understand what the other was thinking. Charlotte was a private person, different from Maury, but I knew how much he respected her, because sometimes when he spoke, he would say, Charlotte might be uncomfortable with me revealing that, and he would end the conversation. It was the only time Maury held anything back. I've learned this much about marriage, he said now. You get tested. You find out who you are, who the other person is, and how you accommodate or don't. Is there some kind of rule to know if a marriage is going to work? Maury smiled. Things are not that simple, Mitch. I know. Still, he said, there are a few rules I know to be true about love and marriage. If you don't respect the other person, you're going to have a lot of trouble. If you don't know how to compromise, you're going to have a lot of trouble. If you can't talk openly about what goes on between you, you're going to have a lot of trouble. And if you don't have a common set of values in life, you're going to have a lot of trouble. Your values must be alike. And the biggest one of those values, Mitch? Yes? Your belief in the importance of your marriage. He sniffed, then closed his eyes for a moment. Personally, he sighed, his eyes still closed. I think marriage is a very important thing to do, and you're missing a hell of a lot if you don't try it. He ended the subject by quoting a poem he believed in like a prayer. Love each other or perish. Okay, question, I say to Maury. His bony fingers hold his glasses across his chest, which rises and falls with each labored breath. What's the question? He says. Remember the book of Job from the Bible? Right. Job is a good man, but God makes him suffer to test his faith. I remember. Takes away everything he has, his house, his money, his family, his health, makes him sick to test his faith. Right, to test his faith. So I'm wondering, what are you wondering? What you think about that? Maury coughs violently. His hands quiver as he drops them by his side. I think, he says, smiling, God overdid it. The 11th Tuesday, we talk about our culture. Hit him harder. I slapped Maury's back. Harder. I slapped him again. Near his shoulders, now down lower. Maury, dressed in pajama bottoms, lay in bed on his side, his head flush against the pillow, his mouth open. The physical therapist was showing me how to bang loose the poison in his lungs, which he needed done regularly now, to keep it from solidifying, to keep him breathing. I always knew you wanted to hit me, Maury gasped. Yeah, I joked as I wrapped my fist against the alabaster skin of his back. This is for that B you gave me my sophomore year. Whack. We all laughed, a nervous laughter that comes when the devil is within earshot. It would have been cute, this little scene, were it not for what we all knew it was, the final calisthenics before death. Maury's disease was now dangerously close to his surrender spot, his lungs. He had been predicting he would die from choking, and I could not imagine a more terrible way to go. Sometimes he would close his eyes and try to draw the air up into his mouth and nostrils, and it seemed as if he were trying to lift an anchor. Outside, it was jacket weather. Early October, the leaves clumped in piles on the lawns outside West Newton. Maury's physical therapist had come earlier in the day, and I usually excused myself when nurses or specialists had business with him. But as the weeks passed and our time ran down, I was increasingly less self-conscious about the physical embarrassment. I wanted to be there. I wanted to observe everything. This was not like me. But then, neither were a lot of things that had happened these last few months in Maury's house. So I watched the therapist work on Maury in the bed, pounding the back of his ribs, asking if he could feel the congestion loosening with him. And when she took a break, she asked if I wanted to try. I said, yes. Maury, his face on the pillow, gave a little smile. Not too hard, he said. I'm an old man. I drummed on his back and his sides, moving around as she instructed. I hated the idea of Maury's lying in bed under any circumstances. His last aphorism, when you're in bed, you're dead, rang in my ears. And curled on his side, he was so small, so withered. It was more a boy's body than a man's. I saw the paleness of his skin, the stray white hairs, the way his arms hung limp and helpless. I thought about how much time we spend trying to shape our bodies, lifting weights, crunching sit-ups, and in the end, nature takes it away from us anyhow. Beneath my fingers, I felt the loose flesh around Maury's bones, and I thumped hard, as instructed. The truth is, I was pounding on his back when I wanted to be hitting the walls. Mitch? Maury gasped, his voice jumpy as a jackhammer as I pounded him. Uh-huh. When did I give you a B? Maury believed in the inherent good of people, but he also saw what they could become. People are only mean when they're threatened, he said later that day. And that's what our culture does. That's what our economy does. Even people who have jobs in our economy are threatened because they worry about losing them. And when you get threatened, you start looking out only for yourself. You start making money a god. It is all part of this culture. He exhaled. Which is why I don't buy it. I nodded at him and squeezed his hand. We held hands regularly now. This was another change for me. Things that before would have made me embarrassed or squeamish were now routinely handled. The catheter bag, connected to the tube inside him and filled with greenish waste fluid, lay by my foot near the leg of his chair. A few months earlier, it might have disgusted me. It was inconsequential now. So was the smell of the room after Maury had used the commode. He did not have the luxury of moving from place to place, of closing a bathroom door behind him, spraying some air freshener when he left. There was his bed, there was his chair, and that was his life. If my life were squeezed into such a thimble, I doubt I could make it smell any better. Here's what I mean by building your own little subculture, Maury said. I don't mean you disregard every rule of your community. I don't go around naked, for example. I don't run through red lights. The little things I can obey. But the big things, how we think, what we value, those you must choose yourself. You can't let anyone or any society determine those for you. Take my condition, the things I am supposed to be embarrassed about now. Not being able to walk, not being able to wipe my ass, waking up some mornings wanting to cry. There is nothing innately embarrassing or shaming about them. It's the same for women not being thin enough or men not being rich enough. It's just what our culture would make you believe. Don't believe it. I asked Maury why he hadn't moved somewhere else when he was younger. Where? I don't know. South Africa, New Guinea, someplace not as selfish as America. Every society has its own problems, Maury said, lifting his eyebrows, the closest he had come to a shrug. The way to do it, I think, isn't to run away. You have to work at creating your own culture. Look, no matter where you live, the biggest defect we human beings have is our own short-sightedness. We don't see what we could be. We should be looking at our potential, stretching ourselves into everything we can become. But if you're surrounded by people who say, I want mine now, you end up with a few people, with everything in a military to keep the poor ones from rising up and stealing it. Maury looked over my shoulder to the far window. Sometimes you could hear a passing truck or the whip of the wind. Sometimes you could hear a passing truck or a whip of the wind. He gazed for a moment at his neighbors' houses, then continued. The problem, Mitch, is that we don't believe we are much alike as we are. Whites and blacks, Catholics and Protestants, men and women. If we saw each other as more alike, we might be very eager to join in one big human family in this world, and to care about that family we care about our own. But believe me, when you are dying, you see it is true. We all have the same beginning, birth, and we all have the same end, death. So how different can we be? Invest in the human family. Invest in people. Build a little community of those you love and who love you. He squeezed my hand gently. I squeezed back harder. And like that little carnival contest where you bang a hammer and watch the disc rise up the pole, I could almost see my body heat rise up Maury's chest and neck into his cheeks and eyes. He smiled. In the beginning of life, when we are infants, we need others to survive, right? And at the end of life, when you get like me, you need others to survive, right? His voice dropped to a whisper. But here is the secret. In between, we need others as well. Later that afternoon, Connie and I went into the bedroom to watch the O.J. Simpson verdict. It was a tense scene as the principals all turned to face the jury, Simpson in his blue suit, surrounded by his small army of lawyers, the prosecutors who wanted him behind bars just a few feet away. When the foreman read the verdict, not guilty, Connie shrieked, "Oh my God!" We watched as Simpson hugged his lawyers. We listened as the commenters tried to explain what it all meant. We saw crowds of blacks celebrating in the streets outside the courthouse, and crowds of white sitting stunned into restaurants. The decision was being hailed as momentous, even though murders take place every day. Connie went out in the hall. She had seen enough. I had heard the door to Maury's study's close. I stared at the TV set. Everyone in the world is watching this thing, I told myself. Then, from the other room, I heard the ruffling of Maury's being lifted from his chair, and I smiled. As the trial of the century reached its dramatic conclusion, my old professor was sitting on the toilet. It is 1979, a basketball game in the Brandeis gym. The team is doing well, and the student section begins to chant, "We're number one! We're number one!" Maury is sitting nearby. He is puzzled by the cheer. At one point, in the midst of "We're number one," he rises and yells, "What's wrong with being number two?" The students look at him. They stop chanting. He sits down, smiling and triumphant.